Good morning. Today is May 13th, and one may wonder why, if the world is coming apart in the Middle East and Gaza and whatnot, that I want to focus on Europe today, because Europe is very essential to the United States. It is our area of key alliance. The links between Europe and the United States are both historically and contemporary extremely important, and yet the relationship seems to be fraying. So let me get something off the topic for a moment by saying one of the great concerns, but not the only concern, and not the main concern I want to talk about this morning, is that what happens if Donald Trump becomes president again? Because he is on the record of essentially saying to Europe, "The hell with you." He is on the record of having said to Russia, if they want to go invade some other European countries, go for it. And he has some alliances with a few countries in Europe, for example, Orban in Hungary, and other authoritarian dictators, one in Serbia and one or two others. So most of what we consider to be our alliances in Europe are ones that he says he couldn't care less about, and he's perfectly willing to disengage. So that scares the hell out of European countries. But leaving that possibility aside, there are other issues because why? Not just because of the war in Ukraine, but because of global changes. One of the ways that, the writers and experts talk about it is that we have now entered an era of deglobalization. And you may all remember that for some years now, when it kept talking about globalization, meaning what? Meaning globalized trade, economic development, increasingly the desire to have globalized policies for climate change, and in general, breaking down some of the barriers across the universe. And the globalization that we became used to after the Second World War, but even more so after the end of the Cold War in 1989, seems to be fraying. And it's fraying for a lot of complicated but interesting reasons, and it potentially could have a major impact. And the first thing I want to address is international institutions, because many of the international institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, and so forth, were all built and structured to address the post-World War II period. And their role in the world has either declined or has changed, although I don't want to talk about the global institutions at the moment, but at some other time. But institutions, regional international institutions, were also developed after the Second World War and after the Cold War, and became very central. The most obvious one is the European Union, right, which started with, a small number, half a dozen countries, and now encompasses most of Europe, East and West. And then there's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes the United States and Canada, but is very important, and we've read a lot about it, the role of NATO in terms of the incursions by Russia, etc., and what role NATO should play or will need to play if Russia moves beyond the Ukraine. So those are two dominant ones, but there are many others that are spin-offs and related, especially to European Economic Community. There's the European Bank. There's human rights organizations. There are, any number of scientific and transport and so forth organizations, which are meant to be collective or making policy for all the members of the European Union. And the idea of the European Union was not, it was intended to be economic and technical, not military. NATO was supposedly taking care of that. And a fair amount of the energy, the tax money, the political currency over the decades has been in the development of these European institutions, which were thought of in most cases as helping all the countries. The weaker countries got resources. For example, when Spain and Portugal entered the European Union, they were much economically less developed in the more central European countries like England and France and Italy, and they got lots of resources to bring them up to the economic level that made them better partners and a more stable general European environment. And all the national politicians, whatever their attitudes and policies were domestically, also always argued, or almost always argued, with very few exceptions, of the importance to the collective life of Europe, and therefore peace in Europe and Europe's dealing with the rest of the world, because there are many small European countries, so it would give them leverage in their relationship with the rest of the world. That this was a key and important aspect of the modern Europe. Well, this system still exists. You still have the EU, you still have the other institutions, but the role they are playing in Europe is being eroded. And it's being eroded in a number of ways. The first and most important is that increasingly in Europe, you have right-wing nationalist leaders coming into power, and they echo the sort of same thing that, let's say, Trump echoes in the United States, that, the most important thing is ourselves and our borders, and we are disadvantaged by economic and technical and other relationships. And even if we're not totally disadvantaged, we want to control our relationships and make sure that we are not at a disadvantage, and so forth. The extreme version of this happened when the United Kingdom, a Brexit, you will recall, left the European Union. And what that was a right-wing nationalist movement, which attributed a lot of the domestic problems, economic, political, and so forth problems, to being handicapped by being members of the OEU. And the election and the support of extreme right-wing and also conservative aspects of the United Kingdom led to Brexit. Now, we're now talking 2024. There are many people in the Brexit countries which are now saying that was a mistake. And on the more sort of left of center, the political parties in England, in Scotland, and so forth, Ireland, were anxious to renegotiate, not coming back to the European Union, but making agreements to get some of the benefits of the European Union. In other words, they see that as a mistake. But in Brexit is seen as somewhat of a mistake. But in continental Europe, the idea of more nationalism, less cooperation, criticism of the European Union, they're too bureaucratic and they're not effective and they're not, doing us all the good we need to do. We need to protect our economy. We need to protect our populations. And on it goes, in the idea of getting the body politic in European countries to not exactly leave the European Union, but weaken it and make it less relevant. So at the very time that Europe is threatened, and we'll talk about this in a moment, and there's talk about having to strengthen NATO on the EU economic side, there is a lot of national discussion and talk about weakening the ties, or in any event, not strengthening and modernizing the European Union. You're saying, well, here we live in California. What do we care about any of this? Well, we care, first of all, about the economic and political and military well-being of our dominant allies, which is Europe at the end of the day. So the fraying of the interdependence of European countries, or at least the fraying of the leverage of the institution, or if not actually changing them, allowing them to weaken and not address appropriate needs and policies, should be of keen interest to the United States. Because if, for example, in France, Macron, right, is this right of center leader in France, but it's very possible that Marine Le Pen wins the next election, and then you have a right-wing nationalist who doesn't really believe in the European Union. Interestingly enough, you have a right-wing nationalist in Italy that got elected, Meloni, and she is actually not disengaging from the EU, or at least not making loud noises about disengagement and nationalism on the economic and financial front. So at the moment, it's a mixed picture, but it's also a very serious and potentially destabilizing picture in Europe. And if, for example, Russia decides to move into countries that beyond Ukraine, Moldavia, maybe some of the Balkans, it requires, many observers believe, and I agree with that it also requires economic cooperation and coordination. And so this is a fairly bad time for the role and the purpose and the need for modernization of the European Union to be weakening. Now, most of this is still political talk. It hasn't actually happened. That is to say, the reforms that are necessary in Europe aren't particularly taking place. But the unraveling of the regionalization of Europe, which is part of what globalization was about, is certainly on the agenda in quite a lot of countries. Now, if you've listened to the news or read the papers, you might have also seen that the center of operations in Europe is moving from the west to the east. And that is also an interesting phenomenon, because the European connectivity was most strongly among Western European countries. And increasingly, countries like Poland, and Romania and Bulgaria to some extent and so forth, are playing a more dominant role in Europe. And so the attention of the European Union, of the decision makers, increasingly is shifting to the East European countries to draw them in, to get them to participate, to see that the organization is important, while at the same time you have weakening links in the stronger economic and political countries up until now in Western Europe. And that is, a rather interesting development. Now, there are other things going on, and I don't want to oversell this particular issue, because part of what European countries are doing in terms of trade policies, in terms of environmental policies, and I'll talk about human and immigration policies in a minute, has to do not just with decoupling from the European Union, but also has to do with the increasing importance of, for example, trade with China, right? Technological exchanges with the Far East and developments in the technical fields, and the employment situation in some Western European countries is to some extent at risk. For example, in Germany, where many of the factories that produce things like, cars and washing machines and the rest, which used to be exported to China, now you have some of reversals of China exporting or wishing to export its cars, its technology, and so on to Europe. So individual European countries are saying, well, on the one hand, we're tethered to these collective historical institutions, but on the other hand, we're trying to sort of go it alone bilaterally with countries that are of interest to us. Two more topics on this regard. One is what is leading the politicians in many countries to move rightward, and the elections becoming rightward and more nationalistic. And that is very often tied to immigration, which is something down the line I also want to discuss in terms of the US, and its effect on US politics. There are millions of people trying to get into European countries, just like there are millions of people trying to get into the United States. And you've probably seen on TV, people are drowning in the English Channel and all the rest of it. And there is a political backlash in many countries, even countries like UK and France and Germany, which historically have absorbed a lot of immigrants. There are now objections to the absorption of immigrants. And there's a considerable amount of racism involved, just as there is in this country. And ironically, the objection, the political objection to some fairly homogeneous cultural countries in Europe to be changed to immigration with different religions, cultures, and so on, coincides with something which one wished people could see, which is the rapid aging of the population in all industrial countries, but also very heavily in most European countries. An aging population means effectively that immigrants are necessary to sustain the economies of those countries. So both in the United States, where we could use a million more workers, we're screaming we don't want these immigrants. And in Europe, you have the same thing. You have the countries screaming, we've had enough immigration, we don't need more immigration. Even a country like Germany, which under Angela Merkel was very hospitable to allowing, millions of immigrants, asylum seekers and others into the country, even a country like that is now having a political right wing in particular, which is arguing, let's not have all these immigrants. So the reality, the economic reality in the next decade for those countries is not being taken into account by the very people who will need those immigrants to keep their economies strong. So that's kind of an irony. The other kind of irony is that this sort of nationalistic, let's unravel international institutions is a backlash, as I said, to immigration, but it's also a miscomprehension of the fact that environmental policy and the rapidly warming globe requires the very sort of cooperation and integration which is fostered by having global and regional institutions. So just as the arguments against immigration are counterproductive and will be within the next decade, so the current kind of wanting to withdraw from regional and international environmental policies, organizations, and activities is not just counterproductive down the line in the 5 years and 10 years, but is counterproductive as we speak. So the internal politics of European countries right now is very tense actually in a way our politics are tense, Is Trump going to get elected or is Biden going to get elected? Well, is Macron is not going to run again, but will a political party, center or right of center, be able to float a candidate that can win? Or will Marine Le Pen, after years of trying to move left, and as many of the extremists on the right and the left worldwide, they tend to be authoritarian, right? And or have authoritarian tendencies. At the very moment that these people look like they will politically maybe succeed and change Europe and therefore unravel the regional institutions, and deglobalize, if you will, although in this case de-regionalize, much that has been built up in the last 50, 70 years, because there is a political backlash in the countries, because politicians, and we can see this here at home with President Trump, are not only arguing that we will be more nationalistic in terms of international politics, more sanctions, more tariffs, more this, more that, keep the immigrants out, and I don't need to rehearse the litany of that. You have those kinds of tendencies and litanies now in if not all European countries, but in many European countries, including West European countries. Now, again, I said that United Kingdom is an exception right now because they have had a right-wing government which has failed them badly economically and socially, and it's likely that the Labour Party will win the next parliamentary election. You will have a Labour prime minister. But you can see it, the move to the right and to greater nationalism, greater anti-immigration, greater wanting to undermine the regional institution is happening increasingly, not just in France, but in the Scandinavian countries, where right-wing parties have won, a relatively large numbers of seats in parliament, or even have prime ministers now, and so on. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying here is, while we're focused on, some dire international events, like both globally and in Europe, and I was concentrating today on Europe, is the unraveling of the institutions that were carefully built to have interlinkages, have institutions, reduce the amount of activity of national governments in some areas, for example, the movement of people, the movement of goods, the movement of technology, and laws, human rights laws, courts that could adjudicate it. That whole infrastructure is slowly unraveling. Some of it, I will admit, is the fault of the institutions. Institutions very often become sort of satisfied with themselves. They're less innovative. They're less willing to change themselves. But I guess my thesis this morning is that, quite aside from the normal kind of bureaucratization of institutions, which require updating and refreshing and good leadership, you also have in Europe, East and West, a drive brought about by both centrist governments to some extent, or just right of centrist governments, which as well as real right-wing governments and parliamentaries coming into power, which are not just sort of constitutionally nationalists, and nationalists in the sense that it's not nationalism and celebrating one's culture and language and so forth, but nationalists in the sense of we want to go it along. And the careful sort of regional institutions that were built that are part of the global institutional structures is slowly getting decoupled, or as the literature says, you having deglobalization. So this morning, I just wanted to talk about a chunk of that in Europe. And since our interdependence with Europe and what goes on in Europe seems very far away in California, it's both historically and contemporarily the most important alliances we have had. And we can't just say, well, we're not interested in Europe anymore. We're going to, have, alliances with other countries. And what happens in Europe is of little interest other than tourism, which is about to start, and some of you might go to Europe this summer, so you might want to look at those institutions in Europe and see what Europeans have to say about the nationalism and the hostility to some of those European institutions that are now arising in their countries. Okay, see you in 2 weeks.